In this lecture, we'll be talking about the concept of aggregate demand as the demand in the entire economy, where before we talked about demand as only being a microeconomic factor, that is, the quantity demanded of a certain good or service of a particular firm. Now we are talking about the overall quantity demanded by the economy. So let's look at the definition of aggregate demand. So aggregate demand is the overall demand for goods and services in the economy. And so aggregate demand can be broken down into an equation. So we have aggregate demand, which is AD equals C plus I plus G, G1 plus G2 plus net exports. And net exports can be broken down into two again, which can be classified as exports, denoted by X, and minus imports. Okay, so let's just break this equation down into separate parts now. So firstly we have C. What is C stand for? C is the consumption by private households. So consumption by private economic agents. And so this is household expenditure to satisfy our immediate needs and wants for durable and single-use goods and services such as food, clothing, rent, transport, power, entertainment, childcare, education, and all that. So the list can go on. And so this is the overall demand by consumers. So this is consumer demand. Secondly, we have I, which involves the total investment expenditure by businesses. And this involves the purchase of capital, property, plant and equipment, and other machinery that help a business survive. So this includes machinery, buildings, aircrafts, dams, fertilizers, computers, and farm vehicles, and so on. So this expenditure not only helps raise the nation's productive capacity, but also makes it possible so that we can shift our aggregate supply curve to the right, so that improves the efficiency of our allocation of resources. So this investment expenditure represents around 20% of our overall expenditure, whereas the consumption expenditure represents 60% of aggregate demand. Thirdly, we have G, which is G1, which is current government spending. And this involves government payouts to subsidies to businesses, government expenditure on any current good or service that the government provides. So this incorporates spending on staff wages, on politicians, education officers, teachers, and all that, all defense spending, all the day-to-day running uses of the government. Government spending, however, we must note, does not include the welfare payments that they pay out, which is included in C. So let's note that G does not include welfare payments. And this is because it is under the assumption that people who receive welfare will be spending that money on consumer goods. So this is in fact injected back into the economy as C. And finally we have G2, which is all capital or non-current government spending. And what this is that every purchase made by the government which has a useful life of greater than 1 year, which is defined as non-current. So this could include spending on transport, buildings, roads, railways, water supply, anything that is non-current. So anything that would last for more than 1 year in the government budget. And now finally, if we have room, we'll just rub out the definition of aggregate demand so we can fit in net exports. So net exports is what? So net exports is the net exports over imports. So this takes into consideration exports minus imports. What this means is that this includes everything that we purchase from other countries in the form of imports, taken away from everything that we sell to other country in the form of exports. And so we don't include imports into our equation of aggregate demand because we assume that aggregate demand is the demand of our economy, and therefore anything that we purchase from other economies represents as an outflow of purchasing power from this economy, and so must not be included in aggregate demand. Okay, so that is the equation of aggregate demand. Now we can draw the aggregate demand like we do as a macroeconomic demand curve. So aggregate demand curve exhibits the same behavior as a microeconomic demand curve, which you can see here. So the aggregate demand curve, instead of having the price as the y-axis, we have inflation denoted by pi, the Greek letter pi, and instead of the quantity demanded as the x-axis, we have y, or total output, or GDP. And GDP is measured in real terms. And so the aggregate demand curve for the economy also exhibits a downward sloping nature. And this shows that as inflation decreases from pi 1 to pi 2, we can see that the overall demand in the economy, or the output in the economy, will increase from y1 to y2. And now in the next lecture we will talk about why this demand curve is in fact downward sloping. But for this lecture it is important to know that aggregate demand here is a component of 5 different factors, which are consumption expenditure by households, investment expenditure by businesses, government current expenditure, which is G1, government capital or non-current expenditure, which is G2, and net exports.